Have you ever wondered why Chicago, one of America's most vibrant cities, is often associated with notorious gangs? The roots of this reputation trace back to the 19th century, a time of significant social changes and immigration, which laid the groundwork for the birth of gangs in Chicago. As the city began to boom, so too did the diversity of its population. This melting pot of cultures created a unique dynamic, one where groups formed out of necessity, camaraderie, and protection. These early formations marked the beginnings of organized gang culture in the city. The 1920s brought about another significant shift with the onset of Prohibition. Suddenly, there was a lucrative underground market for alcohol, and the gangs of Chicago were all too ready to step into the role of suppliers. This era defined the city's gang culture, setting a precedent for the organized crime networks we see today. So it appears the roots of Chicago's gang culture are deeply intertwined with the city's history and socio-economic changes. If you thought the early days were tumultuous, brace yourself for the era of organized crime. As the Roaring '20s came to a close, Chicago found itself plunged into a new era of organized crime. From the 1930s to the 1960s, the city's underworld became a breeding ground for notorious gangsters and syndicates, each vying for control of the streets and the lucrative opportunities they presented. One name that rose to infamy during this period was none other than Al Capone. Known for his charismatic charm and ruthless tactics, Capone, with his Chicago outfit, ruled the city's underworld with an iron fist, making millions from illegal alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. But it wasn't just the allure of money and power that fueled the rise of organized crime. The Great Depression of the '30s and the events of World War II played a significant role as well. As economic hardships swept across the nation, many saw crime as the only way to survive. And with many men away at war, the city's gangs found new ways to expand and consolidate their power. Yet, despite the chaos, this era also saw the development of syndicates, organized groups that brought a new level of sophistication to the city's criminal underworld. They operated like businesses, using their influence to control politicians, law enforcement, and even the city's legitimate businesses. In this era, gangsters rose to infamy and their activities became more organized, contributing to the dark underbelly of Chicago. Moving from the past to the present, let's examine how modern gang culture has evolved in Chicago. From the '70s onwards, there's been a seismic shift, from the traditional organized crime syndicates to more fragmented street gangs. This fragmentation is like a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting its own distorted view of power and territory. The rise of drugs in the '70s and '80s played a significant role in this shift. Crack cocaine, in particular, became the oil that fueled the engine of gang violence, with territories marked and defended based on the lucrative drug trade. Poverty and social instability, the twin specters haunting many of Chicago's neighborhoods, provided a fertile ground for gangs to grow and flourish. These street gangs, often born out of desperation and the need for protection, became a twisted form of community. They offered a warped sense of belonging to those on the fringes, those who felt forgotten by the society. Law enforcement agencies have been wrestling with the hydra that is gang culture for decades. From increased patrols to community outreach programs, the city has tried to combat the issue from all angles. But it's like trying to hold back the tide with a broom. Every time a gang is dismantled, another two spring up in its place. Despite the city's best efforts, modern gang culture remains a challenging issue in Chicago. So, what have we learned about the history of gangs in Chicago? Well, let's take a moment to recap the key points we've discussed. We delved into the birth of gangs in the 19th century, a time when social unrest and economic disparity set the stage for the rise of these groups. Then, we journeyed through the era of organized crime, a period marked by the rise of infamous figures and the grip they held over the city. And finally, we explored the modern gang culture, where the lines between criminal activity and community loyalty often blur, creating a complex and ever-changing dynamic. The history of gangs in Chicago is a complex one, deeply rooted in the city's social and economic fabric. It's a story that continues to unfold, shaping the city in ways we might not always see but can't ignore.